Sup guys, Bjorn here. Today I thought I'd tackle a topic that frustrates me sometimes, but is at the end of the day pretty damn understandable, you know. I fell into some of these traps myself when I was learning to play, and after all, it's very hard to know that you're doing something wrong if no one tells you that you're doing it wrong, right? So today we're going to take a look at how to become a better DPS player, what are the things you want to focus on, what are the things that are overvalued by the community, in which order do you do things, and what are actually the important parts. So don't forget to comment if you have something to say. I'll be responding to all of them, and hit that subscribe button below if you want more 9.1 content coming out pretty much every single day, or at least on a regular basis. Without further ado, let's get into the video. So how do you actually become a good DPS player? What are the important parts? What parts are overhyped? How do you improve without being completely overwhelmed by all the spells or your rotation? This video is mostly gonna apply to Mythic Plus because there's more room to use utility and stuff like that in Mythic Plus, and there's also a bit of a varied damage profile in Mythic Plus. But if you're a raid player, you can definitely take stuff from this and you can apply it in your own context in the raids. There are a ton of different scenarios in raids where all of this stuff is going to be super useful for you to know, so keep that in mind. Now, WoW is a very hard game, right? It's a complex game. It's tough to get into if you're new. You not only have like a ton of different spells, but you have a ton of different keybinds for all those spells, right? They're effective in a ton of different situations. You need pretty much an insane amount of game knowledge to make a correct decision in every single situation, right? And if you're new to the game or you don't know a lot about PvE, it's very easy to get bogged down in specifics. You know, for example, when I started playing, I had this golden standard of playing a DPS in my head, right? I wanted to play my rotation perfectly. I wanted to use my CDs with as little downtime as possible. You know, I wanted to use them on cooldown every single time to not lose damage. And that's how I thought I would like maximize my damage, right? And then I also thought about using utility, using survivability, of course, but they were more in the back of my mind. Now, I think a lot of people think like this, at least DPS players, and I think it's very it's not at all how the game actually works on a practical level, because all of those things on the list are generally correct individually, but there are some big problems with them, and definitely especially with the order I was focusing on, and also just some of the specifics, and there are some important stuff missing in that list as well that I just didn't know about. So I did have a very poor understanding of the game. It was hard for me to know why this list that I had was a bad idea to strive for, you know, why focusing on those things in that order was a bad idea. So I just wanted to share some of those misconceptions here. Well, you should really think of your effectiveness as a DPS player as something you're building up, right? If you're a poor player relatively to the rest of the player base, right? I'm not saying this to shit on you. If you're bad at the game, you are bad at the game. There's nothing more to it. You're just gonna have to accept it and get better, or you can just not accept it and not get better. But that's entirely up to you. Either way, you're still bad, right? It doesn't matter what you think. So, and this list I had in my head was coming from just not understanding what's actually important at a higher level of play, right? So instead of having as point one on the list to play the rotation perfectly straight away, right? I'm bad at my spec. Why would I be able to play the rotation perfectly? That's super tough to do. That's rough. It's much better to improve on every aspect of the spec in increments and just take it one thing at a time, you know. Don't go too crazy. So as I said, we're mainly going to take a look at Mythic Plus. So if some of these examples are from Mythic Plus, just keep that in mind. You can apply this to raids as well. Playing your rotation, right, is the first thing we're going to take a look at, and it's basically the basis of every DPS at the end of the day, right? You are still going to do damage. That's why you're there. That's your role. So instead of taking this to the extreme and saying I want to play my rotation to 100% perfection, you could just play your rotation to like 70, 80, 90% effectiveness while not concentrating on it as much, you know, just getting comfortable with it, pressing abilities without really looking at your action bars, just doing damage, doing suboptimal damage, sure, but it's not the worst damage in the world. It's still some pretty decent damage, right? That's going to be the foundation of you as a DPS player, right? If you learn to just press your rotation without looking at your action bars, without looking too much at your spells all the time, and just keep your focus open to the game around you, that's the foundation for a DPS player. And even just playing the rotation at a very basic level will do some good damage still. So don't be too disheartened if you can't play rotation exceptionally well. Just playing at a decent level is definitely good enough for almost all aspects of the game. So you're playing your class to a decent effectiveness, right? You've got your rotation on. What's the next step? Well, a couple of years ago I might have said, well, I just get better at the rotation, right? It's pretty obvious. I'm a DPS player. Next step, get better at the rotation. But it's really not that at all, and it's a stupid pitfall to get into, because then you're gonna end up just crippling your group and probably performing worse. So, for an example, the difference between someone doing 5.2k DPS and someone doing 5.5k DPS, it's not that huge, you know? It's not really gonna matter which one of those two players you have in your group. Sure, you might complete the dungeon a little bit smoother, a little bit quicker with the higher DPS, but at the end of the day, it's probably not going to make or break your group. However, the difference between someone using their utility, their defensives, their interrupts at the right moments, and someone not doing any of that is actually insanely huge, right? And that difference can make or break the group in a lot of cases. So my recording software is fucking up, so I had to switch setup sadly, but nonetheless, therefore, after you've gotten comfortable with your general rotation, instead of trying to perfect it, you can challenge yourself by using all of your other abilities, right? All the utility, all the survivability, the interrupts, stuff like that. You know, learn what spells you should interrupt in all of the dungeons. What are the dangerous spells? You know, the spells that are going to wipe your group. Get an interrupt tracker to make sure you don't overlap with your group. Well, you can if you can use your class utility. Every class has some utility, right? If you have an AoE stun, use it to allow your tank to get some aggro at the start of big pulls, maybe. If you have a single target stun, you could use it to cancel difficult spell casts, like the Loyal Beast, for example, in Halls of Atonement is a really tough spell cast that you should definitely single target stun. You can use mob control like Typhoon and stuff to knock stuff out of Sanguine. You can use off healing to help your group if your healer is struggling. You can use things like Earth Elemental, Balanced Trees to help your tank if it's doing a mega pull. If you have Mind Soothe, Imprison, stuff like that, you can use it to skip packs. You know, there's a ton of stuff you can do with a ton of different spells in the dungeons, and it's most likely gonna end up contributing a lot more than a very tiny increase in DPS, right? So after you've got your basic rotation down, which is going to be most of your damage, or at least some of it in most scenarios, right? Well, the next step is to start using that utility. Start using those interrupts, those stuns, everything you can possibly to make the life easier for your group, right? And if you do this well, if you actually use your utility well, then it's going to be a lot easier for your group to handle a dungeon, right? In a raid, this would translate to maybe using mobility for your group, using a roar to help all of your team get over a tough movement check maybe, or you could grip in certain mobs, for example, if you're a Death Knight. Very, very useful utility right there in raids. There's a ton of examples in raids as well. You're just gonna have to take what I'm saying here and try to apply it to your own scenarios, right? I'm sure you know your own class better than I do. Just with these 2 points here, using your utility well, and knowing your base rotation without having to look at it too much, just by doing these 2 things, you're probably going to end up being better than most of the player base at this point, which is a little bit sad. But then again, WoW is a very complex game, you know. You can't expect everyone to put in a ton of hours practicing and stuff like that, so I understand that there's definitely limitations. Okay, so you're already a pretty decent DPS. The next step, in my opinion, is going to be the defensives. Now, defensives, I guess, are pretty similar to utility, and when I say defensives, obviously you should never die. Like, even when practicing your basic rotation, you should always prioritize not dying first. But there's also a ton of other stuff you can do with defensives that just doesn't just involve not dying, right? Because you need to still help your group out, help your healer out with your defensives, even if there's maybe no like immediate danger of dying. So how do you use your defensives? Well, it once again comes down to just game knowledge, right? If you know which unavoidable damage things are going to come out, which of those are going to hurt and which of those are not going to hurt, and when you need to use your stuff, then you can preemptively use your defensives to help out the group, right? So a great example of this would just be Pride in season 1 of Shadowlands, right? Pride was a mob that spawned 5 times in a dungeon, and as soon as it spawned, it started just AoEing the group, right? But the longer it lived, the harder that AoE damage was to heal for the healer. So if you're a DPS player, and you know this, right? Then the most obvious thing is use the defensive maybe in the latter half of the Pride, right? Because then you're going to take less damage, you're going to help out your healer, and the healer is going to be able to heal the people in your group that maybe doesn't have such a good defensive, right? So rotating through your defensives, using them at appropriate moments is going to help out your group immensely, especially your healer. And I'm sure that any good healer out there knows that, or can recognize when a DPS player is just using their offensives well, and when a DPS player is not using their offensives at all, right? Or using them poorly, because sometimes when you get up to the higher key levels, you know, using your defensives becomes, as well as the utility obviously, but the defensives as well, it becomes just a requirement to even complete the key, right? If you don't use your defensives at the right moments, the healer is not going to be able to keep up, and you're just going to die. And this is probably also the one of the points that translates the most to raids. In raids, there's a ton of different boss abilities that do a lot of group damage, and knowing which of those you should defensive and which you shouldn't is really good, and it's going to help out your raid a ton. So defensives, a very important part of being a DPS player, and if you don't have it down, you're gonna both be crippling your group, and you're probably gonna end up dying a lot more than you have to as well. So you're already a pretty decent DPS by this point, right? You have the basics down, but there's still a ton of things to improve, and surely now has got to be the time to max out that rotation, right? You've got your spec down. No. there's still a lot of different invisible factors that contributes more to your DPS than maxing out the rotation, sadly. Or sadly, it's a good thing in my opinion, but for some people it seems that all they really want to do is just play that rotation as perfect as possible, right? And it is really fun to play rotation perfect, don't get me wrong. One huge thing that is going to contribute so much to your damage is going to be cooldown management. Because your cooldowns as a DPS player are basically where you're pumping, right? It's where you do the most damage. So if you're using them well, then you're going to amplify your damage by a huge amount, and if you're using them poorly, then you're going to cripple your damage. If we go back to the original example of my list, right? I thought that using cooldowns on CD as much as possible would be really good, right? Because then you're minimizing downtime, you're probably going to get the most damage out. But the fact is that it's not that if you pop a CD, you're going to do a static amount of damage, right? The CD popped and the damage done is very dependent on what scenario you're popping it in. If you're popping it on a big AoE pack, then you're going to do a ton of damage. If you're popping it on a 2-target pool, then you're not going to do that much damage, right? This is one of the harder things to improve on as well. You're going to have to play the dungeons, you're going to have to play the raids, you're going to have to know at which timings you want to use your CDs. And it's often the right play to hold them rather than to use them, but obviously always depends on the situation. So if we're going into a specific example, we can say you're doing a 4-target pack into a 12-target pack, right? If you pop your CDs on the 4-target pack, sure, you're going to have them up a little bit quicker, but you're going to end up wasting so much damage because you're going to do much more damage on the 12-target pool coming after than on the 4-target pool. So in that scenario, you'd probably hold them, right? But there's a ton of different scenarios, right? You could have a 3-target pool into a tyrannical boss. Now, you would end up doing more damage on the 3-target pool probably, but it's much more important to kill the tyrannical boss fast, so in that scenario, you would also end up saving them for the tyrannical boss, right? And maybe let's say you have a 3-target pool into a 7-target pool into another 3-target pool into a 12-target pool, for example. We have 4 different mop packs, and you could save it to the 7-target pack, right? You could save it for that first 3-target pool, but then you might not have it up again for the 12 target pool. So in this scenario, even though you're going to end up doing more damage on the 7 target pool, it's better to pop them on the first 3 targets and then let them recharge, and you're going to have them up again by, for example, the 12 target pool, and then you're going to pump on that pool. So it really just comes down to having the dungeon laid out in your mind, you know, where you're going to pop your CDs, how many users are you going to get out, and which packs are the most important to kill for your group. Now, this also comes down to not overlapping CDs with your group sometimes, and not popping at the same packs as your teammates. This is gonna end up requiring some coordination, right? If you're solo pug, maybe you can't really do that, but just having good cooldown management by your own self is really important to do the most amount of damage possible, right? And as we said, with the basic rotation here being 40 to 70% of your damage, well, in some scenarios, cooldown management can actually end up mattering almost more than your basic rotation, just in terms of pure damage, right? So very important here. And in terms of raids, cooldown management is also extremely important, because on a raid boss you might think, well, surely I just want to use them on CD, right? It's just a single target raid boss, I'm not going to gain anything by holding them or not holding them. Well, there's two really big problems with that thought process. First of all, any boss is a set amount of time during the fight, right? If we say, if you have a 3-minute CD and the boss is going to be 5 minutes long, well, then guess what? You're only going to be able to get off 2 uses of that cooldown, regardless of where you use them in the fight. So in that scenario, you could use one at pull, right? And then you could use one 3-minute in, and then you're going to spend 2 minutes without CDs, and you're never going to get your CD back before the boss dies. So then you might as well have used one on pull and one 4 minutes into the fight, right? Or one 1 minute into the fight and one 4.5 minutes into the fight, right? Or whatever combination of those two makes sense, where you still are gonna end up using the cooldown 2 times, right? So in that scenario, it might be worth holding, but also a lot of boss fights have ad phases, have burst phases, have stuff that needs to die, stuff that is much more important than actually killing the boss, might be killing this ad pack really quick. So in that scenario, you might also want to save your CDs for that specific moment. There's a ton with cooldown management, and the next point I have is going to tie in a little bit to cooldown management. You might consider it the same thing depending on how you look at CDs, but I still feel it's a little different, and I think a lot of players struggle with this. So I figured a concrete example to start off with is probably best, right? Let's say you're a Windwalker. I'm playing Windwalker, so I'm using that as an example. You're on the second boss in Halls of Atonement. Do you all guys remember which boss that is? That is like the gargoyle dude who jumps out of the door and starts summoning his little gargoyle casty boys, and he like curses you, and you're gonna have to destroy those gargoyles after you kill them. Well, Windwalker has Whirling Dragon Punch. It's an uncapped AoE ability. It's about a 20-second cooldown. You just like fly up in the air and kick a whole ton, and you do a ton of damage to everything around you, basically. It's one of the most powerful abilities of Windwalker. Now, a normal Windwalker who just does their optimal rotation, well, they would just be sending out Whirling Dragon Punch as soon as possible, right? Because it's a big ability, you want to get it on cooldown as fast as possible, and then you can use it again ASAP. Well, if you're on a boss like Echelon that has this little ad phase, right? He starts summoning his little gargoyle dudes, you have no Whirling Dragon Punch, well, you might think to yourself, no big deal, right? You're still gonna have Whirling Dragon Punch up sooner, it's not really that huge of a mistake, and an extra Whirling Dragon Punch you might get off on the fight, it's gonna cancel out. But let's look at the actual numbers, right? Let's say, for simplicity's sake, the boss fight is really short and you only get 2 Whirling Dragon Punches out, both on single target, if you use it on pull. I mean, no Echelon kill is ever going to be that short, but we're just using it for the sake of the argument. Now, you have another monk that only gets 1 Whirling Dragon Punch out during that entire fight, but he makes sure that he saves it and he hits all the ads and Echelon. Well, guess what? That's 9 targets hit by the Whirling Dragon Punch, so that's just 9 times more damage than any 1 Whirling Dragon Punch on single target would have done. Essentially, it's exactly the same as using 9 Whirling Dragon Punches in a fight on single target. So, while the first monk use 2 Whirling Dragon Punches and he's happy. It's like, wow, I got 2 uses of Whirling Dragon Punch out. Nice. It's not nice. It's very unnice, in fact, because the other monk just did more than 4 times more damage with Whirling Dragon Punch in that fight, even though he only used it once. Another example would be like Cataclysm for Destrolock, you know. If you kata once during a fight, or you kata twice, well, if you hit 8 times the targets and that one kata, it's still gonna be way better, right? Shifting Power for Mage, you know, there's a ton of these abilities that have a decent long cooldown. They're AoE, you want to use them on single target still, but holding them for something else on AoE might be way better. The point here is that cooldown management doesn't only apply to your 2-minute CDs, your 3-minute CDs, your big damage buttons. It also applies to every single spell in your spellbook, more or less, right? You want to use every single thing you have as effectively as possible. And I think a lot of players just forget this. A lot of players just randomly mash their rotations on single target. They don't really think about it. They figure, if I play my rotation well enough, it's not really gonna matter that I use my AoE ability here instead of on the ads. Well, turns out it does matter a ton. And I also see a lot of players calling this padding. Like, okay, you know what? Just for the fucking sake of the video, just to make you guys pissed, I'm actually gonna put padding here as the actual fucking title of the thing as well, because then you might actually realize that it's not padding at all. It's just simply playing the fight as best as you possibly could, right? You just wanna actually... Okay, I'm not gonna put padding here, that's a terrible idea. I ended up calling it damage effectiveness instead. Well, guess what? Damage effectiveness is not padding, guys. There's a huge difference. If it's relevant to your group, to your raid, that the mobs are dying, then killing them with an AoE ability is not padding, it's just doing your job. You're a DPS player, things are gonna die, you kill them, right? That's as simple as it gets. Padding is when the mobs don't need to die, right? When there's obsolete things that are just standing there with an HP bar that you could hit, or you could do some single target damage to actually help the fight, right? A good example of this would be the slime room in the other side dungeon, if you remember that, in the Mechagon wing. There's like a little room where you have to jump over all the floods of slimes, and there's like a ton of yellow mobs just flowing through there over and over again. If a balance druid, for example, would hit Starfall there, instead of killing the bots that you're supposed to kill, he would just Starfall all the things on the ground. That's padding, because those things don't need to die. It's not padding if a Windwalker monk saves his Whirling Dragon Punch for when all the ads spawn, right? Those ads needs to die, and he just kills them effectively, much more effectively than any other player. Then he's a good player, he's doing his job well. So stop trying to say that people are padding when they're literally just playing as well as they possibly could, you know? When people are saving their AoE abilities for the Inerva ads in a raid, for example. I've heard that thing being called padding a lot in pugs. It's like, you're just padding, bro. Well, the ads need to die, right? The longer they're up, the more damage we're gonna take. Everyone should be focusing the ads as well as the boss. Obviously, you should probably be cleaving in that scenario. I'm just saying, if you're cleaving, it's definitely not padding. Even though you're gonna be ending up higher on the DPS meter because of it, obviously that's because you're doing more damage than the other people, right? You're playing better than them. It's just that simple. Another example would be Painsmith Rasnal, you know, in the new raid in Sanctum of Domination. You have all these balls coming, he summons like a long line of balls, and they just start rolling towards you. Well, only one of those balls needs to die. So, if you're just mindlessly AoEing all the balls, then yeah, you're padding. But if you're killing that one ball that needs to die, then you're not padding. Okay, we're finally at the last stop. This is where you should be perfecting your rotation. Not until you've mastered all of these things here. When you've learned to play your basic rotation without looking at your bars, when you're using all of your utility, you're rotating all of your defensives at the right moments, you have mastered cooldown management, right? Or maybe not mastered it, but you've actively improved on all of these things, you know? You know when to use your different spells in different scenarios, you're very effective at planning out fights, at planning out dungeons, knowing when to use your spells and when to not. That's when you can start perfecting those last like 10-5% of your rotation. And I'm not only saying this to spite you guys or to try to force you into doing something suboptimal here. I'm just saying, like, perfecting your rotation here, that might result in like a 5% DPS gain, right? It's not huge. It's nowhere near as big as all of these things. Like, as you can see, the basic rotation is like 40 to 70%. Obviously, that's going to depend a lot on the scenario. For example, if you're in a dungeon which has like a ton of single target mobs with AoE packs in between, then your basic rotation might only be like 40% of your damage, because if you're not using your cooldowns effectively and your spells effectively on those AoE packs, then even though you're playing your rotation like perfectly all the time, you're still gonna end up losing a ton of damage because you're using your CDs at the wrong spots, right? But if you're playing, for example, a raid fight, where there's not a whole lot of room for improvement for cooldown management and damage effectiveness, you know, maybe it's a single target fight, well, then your basic rotation might already net you like 70% of your damage, right? So take all this with a grain of salt, these numbers here, but cooldown management and damage effectiveness, I mean, this could be as little as 20%, right? But as much as 50% of your damage, and maybe even more, right? Over the course of a Mythic Plus run, 20 to 50% of your damage is insane. So you should really start looking at these things. And even though I think defensives and utility is still more important than this, because at the end of the day, this is going to end up wiping your group if you get it wrong, whereas this is just going to result in some lower damage numbers if you get it wrong. So, alright guys, this hopefully gave you some things to think about, some tips, some ways for you to improve. If you enjoyed the video, if you want more content like this, be sure to let me know in the comments, subscribe if you liked it, like if you liked it, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Have a good one.